So let me, without taking you any longer from the substance of the day, introduce Erik Brynjolfsson to talk to you a bit about the second machine age. As I mentioned, Erik is the Schussel Professor of Management Science at MIT Sloan. Erik has undergraduate degrees from Harvard University and a master's degree from Harvard and a PhD from MIT. Erik has a number of responsibilities out in the world that I'm not going to take the time to tell you about, including National Bureau of Economic Research. He's the chairman of the Sloan Management Review for MIT Sloan. He has been an incredible leader for us among the school's faculty, taking us in new directions, both intellectually and with respect to impact. Please welcome Erik Brynjolfsson.
Thanks, Dave. And actually, the very first thing I want to do is add to some of the acknowledgments that Dean Schmidtlein mentioned. Dave Verrill just walked by here, the executive director, but also at the table is Sandy Pentland, who's at the Media Lab, but he's been working more and more closely with us at the Sloan School, helping us understand some of the way these technologies are changing. We've brought back Sinan Aral, who is a PhD student at the Sloan School, and like a prodigal son, he went off to New York and NYU for a few years, and now we've brought him back. He's the best in the world at what he's doing, and we're trying to assemble really the very best team. And of course, Andy McAfee, who we'll be hearing more from all those guys later today. But let me pick up on what Dean Schmidtlein was saying about changing the world, because one of the things that was very exciting for me when he became dean was he really pushed us to go after the big questions that were going to change the world, not just incremental research and teaching, but fundamental changes. And it sort of makes you think, what does it take to change the world? What do you need to change the world? You need a great vision, you need financial resources, you need a small group of committed people, some people have said. But I'm going to take a different tack on that, kind of a nerdier MIT tack, and say that what you need to change the world is really two systems from an engineering perspective. You need a power system, and you need a control system. A power system is something that provides the physical power to move and transform things. The world is made of atoms, mostly, and they're connected by these forces, covalent bonds and gravity and other forces that connect them, that you learn about in physics classes. And it takes physical power to move around and to quite literally change the world. But it also takes a control system. It takes cognitive capabilities, mental power, to know what you want to do with all those things that you are moving around. Otherwise, there's not much point. So you need both a power system and a control system. And one way to look at the sweep of history is that for thousands and thousands of years, both of those systems were us, were people. Humans provided the physical power and the mental power to change the world. And then something really remarkable happened about 200 years ago. It was the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine and later the internal combustion engine and other technologies really eliminated many of the limitations of our own muscles and the occasional ox or horse that was helping us out, and allowed us to move the world, change the world in a way we never could have before, fundamentally transforming the course of human history and boosting our living standards tremendously, orders of magnitude compared to what they were before. And that's why, the main reason why we're so much wealthier now than our predecessors were a century or two ago. But now we're on the midst of what Andy and I call the second machine age, which is when we are beginning to not only use machines to help with the power system, but also the control system. We're just now beginning to have technologies that are able to do cognitive tasks, mental tasks, computer, software, big data, machine intelligence. Now, the old power systems were mostly a complement to humans. That is to say that the value of physical power depended in large part on having humans telling it where they could go. A truck or a locomotive wasn't much use unless there was a person directing it. The new systems, well, it's not so obvious whether these technologies will be complements or substitutes. In some cases, they do amplify the power and value of human labor, but in many other cases, they are substituting for it. and it's an empirical question about what's been happening the past 10 years, which I'll talk about in the next few minutes. But it's also a design question, how you use these technologies, which is perhaps an even more important point. Let's look at how this second machine age is playing out. Let's go back just the past decade or so. One of the seminal books in this field was written by our MIT colleague Frank Levy and Richard Mernon over at Harvard, which I taught in my classes, and it really was very helpful in thinking about what machines could do well and what humans could do well. And I would have a discussion with people like you in this room now. Some of you were perhaps students back at that time. And we would come up with lists of things that were uniquely human, the machines just couldn't do. For instance, autonomous mobility and fine motor control. In fact, there's something called Moravac's paradox, which is the idea that just walking around or being able to pick up a pen or a dime from a table, something that a 3 or 4-year-old can do routinely is something that's incredibly hard, some thought impossible, to teach a machine to do those basic fine motor skills. Language and complex communication was another category. You know, speaking, understanding, writing text, clearly something that humans had an edge in. Just general pattern matching and unstructured problem solving. Sure, computers could solve structured problems, you know, tabulating rows of numbers. That actually, the word computer used to be the name of a job category, but of course now it's the name of a machine that does that kind of computation. But the thinking was that these unstructured problems were outside the domain of humans. And in the book and in my class, we gave as one of the archetypal examples of something that humans could do that machines really weren't equipped to do, was driving a car through heavy traffic. You guys are chuckling because I think you know where this is going. A couple years ago, Andy and I were riding down Route 101 in, yes, a driverless car. And we're kind of grinning like madmen here because we survived that ride, which we weren't sure we were going to do when we first got in the car, and one of the automobiles in front of us, driven by a human, came to a complete dead stop in the middle of the highway. But fortunately, I'm here today to talk to you because our autonomous vehicle did have appropriate exception handling and was able to recognize that sometimes the road does come to a stop, and it drove very smoothly all the way up from Mountain View to San Francisco and back again. And that's one of the things that frankly caught me off guard, because I just said I was teaching in 2004 that was something that machines couldn't do. And the improvement, the fact that we've gone through this inflection point, is really what motivated us not only to work on this book and this broader research initiative, but to get the initiative on the digital economy going, to understand the implications of these remarkable technologies. Let me take a few minutes to describe some of the other changes we've seen in each of those 3 categories, and then I'll talk about some of the economic and social implications of them. So this broad category of machine intelligence includes interacting with the physical world, it includes language, it includes different kinds of problem solving, and when you put them together, I think we are in the midst of a huge one-time change in human history, that people will look at the time before and the time afterwards and think of them as 2 fundamentally different eras. And we are lucky enough to live in these very interesting times, to live at this very unusual point in history where we're going through that inflection point and have some ability perhaps to shape how it's going to play out. When it comes to interacting with the physical world, we're having better and better robots that are able to do some of that fine motor control. This is Baxter, a robot developed by our erstwhile MIT colleague Rod Brooks at Rethink Robotics. His company before that developed the Roomba iRobot. But it can do a lot of fine-grained tasks that previously only people could do. Here it is working on an assembly line, a job that millions of humans have been doing and are doing today, but Baxter can do it for the equivalent of about $4 an hour. And it's even able to pick up some very small objects. We were over there at their headquarters, and it was able to pick up a Connect 4 chip the size of a coin and play the game Connect 4, something that a few years ago wouldn't have been feasible. That's the current generation. We also get to spend some time with our brilliant colleagues elsewhere at MIT. Over at CSAIL, they're playing with this next generation robot. This imposing guy is Atlas. He's about 6 feet tall, 300 pounds. And that's part of the new DARPA robotics challenge, is to teach Atlas how to do a bunch of tasks that only humans have been able to do previously. Walk across a rubble-strewn field, climb up a ladder, walk up to a door, open the door and go through it, go into a room, pick up a hose, attach a nozzle to it, go out and climb into a vehicle, step into it, and drive and steer it. So this is not an autonomous car driving itself. This is Atlas getting into a vehicle and driving it. Now, I should point out that it hasn't succeeded at all of those tasks. If you talk to Gil Pratt, the head of the program at DARPA, he says that he's surprised. He thinks most of the teams, including the MIT team, are ahead of schedule where they're going to be. Will they be able to achieve all those goals within the next 3 years? I honestly don't know. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. It's usually not a good idea to bet against our engineering friends who take on a challenge like that. But that's almost irrelevant, because will they be able to do it within the next 10 years? For sure. So the time frame is a little bit uncertain, but the ability to do these tasks is a near certainty. And those tasks aren't just useful for DARPA and this mock-up of the Fukushima nuclear plant. Those are the same tasks that are done by hundreds of millions of workers all over the world in a variety of situations, in factories and offices and homes elsewhere. So if you can get a machine to do each of those individual tasks, you can get an entrepreneur to think about how to put them together to do more complex jobs. We also have a big revolution going on in voice recognition, driven in large part by the big data revolution. It's an interesting thing, but today it's not that uncommon to see somebody talking to a machine, talking to a little tiny machine, and expecting the machine to understand what you're saying to it and to carry out the instructions and perhaps respond back in a computer-synthesized voice. I mean, let's think about it. That would have been science fiction 10 years ago, that we talk to our machines and they speak back to us. Now, clearly, they're not always great. There's lots of funny mistakes that they make, but we're crossing a threshold over the next 10 years where people will routinely be talking to machines and expecting them to intelligently carry out more and more complicated instructions. They are beginning to do translation. Rick Rashid recently gave a talk in Tianjin, China. He speaks English, but when he gave his talk, it was translated instantaneously into Chinese, not by a team of human translators, but by a machine. We are at the point where we will be able to routinely have those science fiction objects where you speak one language and a person can hear in the other language, and vice versa. Machines are beginning to grade essays for the SATs. And you think if they can grade them, well, maybe they could write them as well. And indeed, there are companies like Narrative Science that are beginning to do some remarkable things. Here in New York, this headline may be a little jarring about the Red Sox winning the World Series. But if you read the story, it's a fairly, standard story, maybe nothing so remarkable about it. But if you zoom in, there's a pretty interesting part of it, which is not the text of the story, but the author, a guy whose name is Automated Insights. Unusual name for a person, not such an unusual name for a robot. There are machines now writing not occasional stories here and there in a laboratory, but tens of thousands of these stories. Go to Yahoo and look at the bylines of some of the stories in Yahoo Sports, and you will see that they are written by robots, not humans. And it's not just in sports, you see it in the financial industry. Many of you here probably read the stories. I don't know if you go ahead and check the bylines, but some of them are written by various types of robots. Now, this is not the most highfalutin prose. This isn't the deepest set of insights, but it's a set of basic blocking and tackling, basic fundamental kinds of writing that needs to be done and that can be scaled up by machines. And finally, there's this whole broad area of unstructured problem solving, which we used to think that was the human edge. And one of my favorite examples of that is just a game. It's a game called Jeopardy. You guys have probably seen when IBM's Watson played the game of Jeopardy. Jeopardy has all sorts of unstructured questions in math and science and sports and literature, current events. You never know exactly what it's going to ask about. And the wording is sometimes kind of tricky and complicated. It's sometimes hard even to know exactly what it is that they're asking. You have to be able to parse those sentences to get at what you're looking at, then comb through all sorts of unstructured knowledge. This is something that seems like a very fundamental human capability. And Ken Jennings, who's over there on the left, was the World Jeopardy champion until recently. He won 75 games in a row. Andy was telling me he thinks he's rumored to have been genetically engineered from birth to play Jeopardy. I'm not sure, but he certainly was very good at it, better than anyone else, until Brad Rutter, the guy on the other side there, did eventually beat him. The team at IBM Watson Labs came and started working on this project. And they actually came to my class at MIT Sloan, and Dave Ferrucci showed me this remarkable chart. And I have to show it to you because it just took my breath away when he demonstrated this. This is a chart of, they took all the data from all the games of Jeopardy that had been played, and they recorded all the winners. And in this case, these little blue dots that kind of look like mosquitoes at the top of the screen there, those are all the human winners, the Jeopardy champions. And they're clustered in the top because they're pretty good. Sometimes they get 100% of the questions right. And the width of it is how many they try to answer, how aggressive they are. Do they try to answer 50% or more of the questions? Well, IBM Watson, when they first developed this tool, it actually wasn't all that great. It only answered about 20 or 30% of the questions correctly. But as you can see, it very rapidly improved. Month by month, it got better and better. It's a line because they could kind of tune it to be more aggressive or less aggressive. They could pick any point along that line. And by the time he showed it to my class, you can see it was already better than about half of the human champions. These are not average humans. These are champions in Jeopardy. And a few months after he showed this to me, they went on national television. And I think many of you know what happened. It was a pretty exciting event. Watson destroyed the human champions. It got more money than both Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter put together. I think the only thing that Brad really had, that Ken had an advantage was that he at least had a good sense of humor about it. In addition to giving his answer, he added, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." But you know, that's a pretty narrow job category, knowledge workers making money on Jeopardy. Guess what? That's not the whole target of this technological revolution. This same technology is being used in call centers. They're tweaking it, because think about it. People call in call centers, they have questions, all sorts of unstructured things. You need a question answering system. It's being used in legal situations. A lot of first-year lawyers are finding that they are not being hired by law firms. I was talking to a partner here in New York recently, and he says they're hiring a lot fewer of them because they have automated systems that answer a lot of questions. I was talking to another lawyer, and she thought that the next thing was not actually first-year law students, but judges. She thought those were the next ones that would be the easiest to automate in certain administrative things. She wasn't joking. Investment banking advice in lots and lots of categories to be touched. Medical diagnosis. We've got systems now that can recognize different kinds of cancer and scan through all the literature. It's estimated if a doctor wanted to keep up on all the new science in their field, it would take about 160 hours of reading per week. So there's 168 hours total in a week, so maybe it's feasible. But Watson, of course, and tools like that can do that. It's being used to help with hiring decisions. So you may be sitting across the table from a machine deciding whether or not it wants to hire you for a particular job. And you could go through categories and categories. Anybody here go to the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference? A few? Yeah, a few people over here. So we saw there's a whole set of technologies being used there. They're used in insurance underwriting and politics. I could go on and on. What does this mean for the economy? What is going to happen? Well, there are a number of big changes, and one of them is what we call the bounty. And a good example of that might be if I ask you all a question. Let's do another quick poll. How many people here currently have some kind of a device that gives them turn-by-turn directions when they're driving? Oh, pretty much everybody. How many of you had a device like that 10 years ago, back in 2004? Anybody? No? There's one over there. 10 years ago, they were pretty hard to come by. They required a specialized piece of hardware. They cost a few $100s for the satellite GPS. But today, you guys all have them because they're built in as an app, typically a free app, into your smartphone. And it's not just GPS. If you go back and look at this ad from the 1990s in Radio Shack, you can go through all the different components here, the computer, the calculator, the phone, of course, the answering machine, if any of you guys remember what that was, the CD player, video recorder, camera. Guess what? They're all in your smartphone, and most of them cost nothing extra. That's a tremendous amount of bounty that we have access to that we didn't have before. It's also helping with medical diagnosis. There are apps that will help diagnose skin cancer. There's technology that is being trained to diagnose breast cancer. Computational pathologist, or CPAT, we call it for short, is a technology that they showed a lot of images of radiological images of breast cancer, and it went through and it learned the 8 key markers of breast cancer that human pathologists had been trained to learn, and it learned it on its own. What's more, in addition to learning those 8 that are taught in medical school, it learned 3 additional ones. It identified 3 additional ones that no one had recognized before. So it was better than the humans at those capabilities. That's great news for all of us. We have lots of goods. We have potentially longer lives. And interestingly, some of this doesn't even show up in the official statistics, even though we benefit from it. I mean, what do all these goods and services have in common? They're digital. They came about in the last few years. And they're basically free. You can get them for nothing. Now, if they have 0 price, how much does that add to GDP? Nothing. It counts as 0. Does that mean it has 0 value to us? No, of course not. It's worth a lot. And the research we're doing at MIT is trying to understand, to quantify this bounty. Our best estimates are that those goods and services we just described are worth about $300 billion of improved consumer surplus, additional value that we're getting that we don't have to pay for. It's good news, by the way, when you get something for free and you don't have to pay for it, at least in terms of, at least if you're a consumer. But there's, and some of that is showing up in the GDP statistics, some of it isn't. But if you just go by the official statistics, it's actually a lot of impressive news. We are at record levels of GDP and GDP per capita. We're at record levels of investment. Profits hit another all-time high. Wealth in the United States is over $80 trillion, another all-time high. So the pie is bigger than it's ever been before. But not everybody is sharing in that. Employment has been falling. The share of Americans who are working didn't just fall off a cliff in the Great Recession recently, but it was below trend before that. And since then, as you can see, that it's sort of bouncing along at the floor there on that chart there. Official unemployment has been dropping. We've been having less unemployment than we did before, but that's mostly not because new people are getting jobs. It's because people are dropping out of the labor force. And so the employment to population ratio really hasn't improved much at all. What's going on here? How can this be? Well, our view, which we first articulated in Race Against the Machine, and we were exploring further in the second machine age, is that the problem isn't that technology isn't improving the economy. It's that technology is moving along just fine, but it's our skills, our organizations, our economic institutions that aren't keeping up. You need both the technology and the organizations and skills to create real value. And to the extent that people aren't keeping up with those skills and our companies aren't re-engineering themselves to take advantage of the technologies, a lot of them are being left behind. You can see that in this chart that Andy and I call the Great Decoupling. For much of the 20th century, GDP, labor productivity, income all kind of grew in tandem. Then starting in the 80s, you saw that median income was having a little trouble keeping up. That's the income of the person at the 50th percentile, different from the average income. And recently, there's really been a wholesale decoupling where productivity and GDP continue to grow just fine, the blue and gray line at the top there, but median income, the 50th percentile, is lower now than it was in the 1990s, as is employment. So this is a real break with the past. It's in a way a break with the implicit social contract we had that a improved technology, a growing pie, would be a tide that lifted all boats. That used to be true. It's not true recently. And that reflects something that took me a little while to really get my head around, but that is this basic fact that, yes, digital progress does make the pie bigger, but guess what? There's no economic law that says that everyone is automatically going to benefit. There's no law that even a majority of people will benefit. It's entirely possible for the pie to get bigger, for wealth to be created, yet some people, 50%, 60%, 80% of the people, to be made worse off, not just in relative terms, but potentially even in absolute terms. We're seeing some of that happening recently. You've undoubtedly heard about the 1% getting pulling away from the rest of the population. And there are lots of causes of that, but I want to focus in on 3 technological drivers of that. 3 sets of winners and losers that have been created by these new technologies that are both growing the pie, but also redistributing it in a very profound way. The first one is what economists call skill-biased technical change, the way that technology has been favoring more skilled workers, increasing the demand for labor that's highly skilled, but reducing the demand for people who have less education and less skill by whichever way we measure it. This chart that Daron Acemoglu and David Otter at MIT put together, I think tells the story in a quite compelling way. You can show it to your kids if they're having any doubts about how much time to spend on education. But you see that early on, there was a rising tide. All levels of education background had growing wages, growing incomes. There was the oil shock and the downturn in the 70s where everybody took a bit of a hit. But since then, things have been spreading out. Folks with graduate school, especially at MIT, I'm sure, have been doing quite well. College graduates have been doing okay as well. But those with less than some college or worse yet, high school dropouts have seen their wages stagnate or even fall in absolute terms. And when you zoom in on what is causing this, what's driving that, some of it's due to offshoring and changes in unionization, but the overwhelming driver has been changes in technology. In fact, in other research, some of our other MIT colleagues found that it was the routine information processing task. Excuse me. Let me just get some water there. I choke up when I... It's the routine information processing tasks that have been hit the hardest. Those are jobs like clerks, tax preparers, middle management. Something like 60% of Americans are involved in information processing work, and many of those have been the quickest to be automated. They tend to be middle-skill, middle-income works, the kind that might require some college or a bit of college education. You can see that the demand for those jobs has dropped, and the wages for those jobs have dropped. Those at the higher end that involve professional work, creative work, entrepreneurial work, they've done better. Interestingly, so far, also those that involve often not a lot of cognitive work, but they might be barbers and gardeners and cooks that involve physical manual work, those have not been affected as much by computerization yet. Although, never say never, these technologies are evolving. The second big set of winners and losers is capital versus labor. As you automate a task, you often substitute capital for labor. You have people like Terry Gao in China, who's got a couple million human workers assembling iPhones and other technologies. And he's made a pledge to put in place 1 million robots to replace 1 million of his human workers. I think he's already placed orders for a couple 100,000 of them. But this is part of a broader trend. When you substitute robots for humans, you can increase productivity, you can increase output, you can make things more cheaply, perhaps higher quality, but you also, the returns from that end up going to capital owners as opposed to labor owners. And this is not just an anecdote, this is showing up in the data. This red line is the share of GDP that's been going to laborers, human workers, total compensation including wages, but also all sorts of benefits. You can see it bounces around a little bit depending on the business cycle, but starting in the year 2000, it started falling, whether the economy was growing or not, and it's hit an all-time low. Meanwhile, the profit share, the share going to capital owners, is at a record high. The third group that I want to talk about is perhaps the most important one, the most fundamental one, which is superstars versus everyone else. And you see it in a number of industries. First, you see it in places like entertainment. Lady Gaga and others can now reach audiences of hundreds of millions or billions. They become very wealthy as their songs reach lots and lots of people they couldn't before. And other media, of course, have faced this. Sports stars see some of that. We also see it in software. Scott Cook, the owner of Intuit, is a billionaire. He makes a number of products. One of them is tax preparation. I mentioned tax preparers as one of those routine information processing jobs. Think about what's happened there. You take a process, you codify it, and you digitize it. And once you've digitized it, what can you do? You can make a copy. You can make 10 copies. You can make 100 million copies, almost for free. Each of those copies is not only very, very cheap to make, but they're a perfect replica of the original. And each of them can be transmitted to anyone in the state, anyone in the country, anyone in the world, essentially instantaneously. Free, perfect, and instant are three adjectives we didn't use to describe most goods and services for centuries. But those are the standard characteristics of digital goods. There are these weird and wonderful economics of the digital world that allow us to have access to all sorts of things that we couldn't have had before, but they also lead to winner-take-all markets. There's not much point in buying the 1,000th best tax preparation software, or even the 10th best. You want to buy the best. Maybe there's 2 or 3 contenders, depending on if you have special needs or there's some slight differentiation there. But by and large, digital markets are winner-take-all or winner-take-most markets. And that's not just the traditional software industry, but Mark Andreessen has this evocative phrase that software is eating the world. And he's right. What he means by that is that the core of every industry, manufacturing, finance, retailing, maybe someday education, is becoming digital and software. And that means those same economics are coming to all of our industries. And you see that in companies like CVS, Larry Marlowe, who has digitized a lot of the order entering process. And now you see some of those same economics coming to every industry. So this also shows up in the data. This is what's happening to not the 1%. We talked about the 1% earlier. But if you look closely at the y-axis here, it's the 1% of the 1%. And the share of income they're getting is at a new record high. There were some highs earlier in the century, but they've never been as high as they are now. And again, I don't want to say that the only cause is technology. There are a number of causes, but those economics I just described to you are a very big part of the story. So what is to be done? I want to wrap up with a point about that, and I want to take some of your questions and comments about that. I showed you earlier the self-driving car and Atlas, the 6-foot robot that's going to be doing all those tasks. Both of those were in response to a DARPA Grand Challenge, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's amazing the power a challenge has to motivate our friends in engineering and science, and just the stunning things, the things that really are almost science fiction that they were able to achieve when that challenge was put in front of them. And I think it's great that they're developing these wonderful technologies that potentially can make us all much, much wealthier, but they're also having huge effects on the nature of the economy. And guess what? We're not keeping up our end at the School of Management and Economics and Social Sciences. We need to reinvent our organizations and institutions to keep up with our technologist friends who are going through this inflection point. So I think that one of the things we need is a new grand challenge, a challenge that understands that these digital technologies will continue to accelerate. The amazing things I just showed you, those are not the crowning achievements of the second machine age. Those are just the warm-up acts. We've got even bigger changes that I'm sure will happen in the next 10 years. I don't know exactly which ones they're going to be, but I see a clear pattern there. So the disruption, the economics disruption that we've seen in the past 10 years is also just a harbinger of even bigger changes coming in the next decade. Our skills and organizations, our institutions are lagging. Humans aren't changing as fast as Moore's law, as fast as these technologies are changing. That means that if we just do nothing, if we do business as usual, the problem is going to get more and more severe. We're going to have more and more grinding and mismatches between what the technology makes possible and what we're doing today. So we need to reinvent our economy. We need to invent our institutions, our society. We need to reinvent management, organization skills, all the things that we do at the Sloan School. And there's no better place than MIT to take on these challenges. So I'm very excited to be able to have a chance to work on that and bring together some of the best minds in the world, some of the best students, some of the best resources. They're all within a few hundred yards of our offices at MIT. There's no better place in the world to be doing that, and there's no better community than the one we have there and the one we have here to help us address these questions. So with that, let me stop and see if you have any questions or comments that you have for me. Thanks very much. Got a question right here.
Thank you. I was a little bit too fast with the hand raising.
Good.
So this is an awesome presentation of an awesome phenomenon. What I want to ask you is, do you see, however you would rank the gravest problems facing the world and civilization, what link do you see between these advances and solutions to those problems?
So I'm quite convinced. I've chosen that this, I think, is the big defining challenge of our era, and it can address some of the other big challenges we have. For instance, take global poverty. Jeff Sachs has said that he thinks we could wipe out global poverty, people who are making less than $1.25 a day, believe it or not, that's the definition, by the year 2035. And I think he's right. I think that these technologies could help doing that by bringing more and more people into the global community. Potentially. I don't think it's going to be inevitable, but potentially we're among the, in addition to the machine learning and intelligence capabilities, there's another set of technologies, we talk about them in the book a little bit, the networks and the digital network that we now have that's connecting billions of brains, soon 7 billion brains, mostly through mobile devices, will be connected to this global marketplace, to global information sources to be able to tap in to better information than the President of the United States had 10 years ago. And perhaps more importantly, or I think, yes, more importantly, they'll be able to contribute to that knowledge base as well as being able to tap into it. That will provide the potential for a lot more people to participate. But I don't think that while that could create a lot of wealth and income, the distribution of that is an open question in terms of who's going to benefit and how much shared prosperity and whether people have the skills to contribute to it, whether entrepreneurs will be able to figure out ways to get people to be productive contributors. But when you have this new set of tools that are being delivered to us, all sorts of problems that previously couldn't be solved will become solvable. The bottleneck, I think, is less and less the technology per se. It's us having the imagination to figure out how to use those technologies. So when I teach my class, I tell my students, you guys are the bottleneck. You guys are the ones that need to figure out how to use these technologies to change the world. They're being rained down upon us by our friends in engineering and science, but it's, in a way, a lack of imagination that's holding us back to addressing some of those problems. Let's take another question, maybe somewhere further in the back. I don't know, does someone have a microphone? About back here. Okay, over here, yep.
With so much automation of labor, do you see like structural changes where certain population just will be constantly unemployed, or how do you see that? And if not, how do you foresee that not happening?
Well, there are a lot of people who foresee that, and there are people like Jeremy Rifkin and others who talk about the end of work and growing unemployment. There's others who see a really happy outcome where I think it was Arthur C. Clarke who said that the goal should be complete unemployment for everybody, and by that he meant that we should all have robots doing all the work for us so we could spend time, I guess, writing science fiction stories and sipping pina coladas. what I can tell you is what the data have shown is that there has been a very striking discontinuous change in the demand for many kinds of people. Those middle skilled jobs have been hit first, but the technologies I show you are increasingly affecting higher skilled jobs, lower skilled jobs, really across the spectrum much more broadly. The big unanswered question, and I'm sincerely unsure what the answer is, as I stand up here in front of all these people here, I gotta tell you, I don't know for sure, and that is whether or not we'll be able to invent enough new jobs to replace the old ones. I'm quite confident the answer is not to try to freeze in the old labor structure from before, even though that's what too many governments are trying to do, that's what too many people are trying to do. In my own fair city of Cambridge, they tried to stop Uber from coming in to protect the taxi drivers' jobs, and enough people replaced. In France, they put in place for a while, believe it or not, a requirement that Uber have a 15-minute delay before they pick people up, so that the taxis would have a chance to get there first. Enough people had an outcry that stopped, but there's this mentality of what Tim O'Reilly calls protecting the past from the future that is a knee-jerk reaction to that. I'm confident that's not a winning strategy. It wasn't a winning strategy for the Luddites 200 years ago. It's not going to be a winning strategy today. The more likely strategy to succeed is to invent those new industries, those new things that Henry Ford and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs invented to replace, say, agricultural work as that became automated away. But I have to say, will we be able to succeed to invent those jobs fast enough? We're not doing it yet. Maybe the initiative on the digital economy can help us understand some creative ways to do that so we can have more people tapping in and creating value. I put it as a challenge rather than as a prediction. How about the other side of the room over here? Okay. Who's got a mic there? Whoops. There we go.
Hi, I'm a community college professor, and we're not teaching our students to think of new ideas. We're teaching them how to memorize what happened in the past.
Yes.
And you're in an education thing. I don't know how much you've got MIT. I heard Anant Agarwal last night on clicks or bricks on what's going to happen. But how are we going to get education to change? Because that's the only way we're going to have the people ready or start thinking ahead of how to change jobs. Thank you.
You're exactly right, and that's part of the answer to the earlier question. And in the book, we talk a lot about education. The initiative will be talking about that. I think you're spot on that Henry Ford needed people to work on the assembly line and follow instructions and be very good at that. And if you look at our 20th century schools with people sitting in rows quietly absorbing information and following instructions and nobody getting too much out of line, that's what we were trying to teach. That's not the skills we need for the 21st century or for the second machine age. As you say, we need creativity. Machines are great at following instructions. Let's let them do that. And we need people to invent and be creative, think of new things. I'm convinced, I've talked to enough educators, that is a teachable skill, or at a bare minimum, it's a skill we don't have to stamp out of our kids, because a lot of them are born with that natural curiosity and creativity. And like Anant Agarwal, I'm quite optimistic about the potential of digital technologies to solve it. I have to say, I don't think necessarily the existing version of MITx or MOOCs is the final optimal solution. But what I like about what he's doing and what really everyone's doing with these digital technologies is they have a whole different mindset. It's a mindset of experimentation. It's a mindset of call it datafication, taking all these digital tools, and when you datafy a process, when you digitize it, you start learning what students are paying attention to, what they're not, what skills they're learning, which skills they're not learning, which sequence they go through it, the individual learning styles. That doesn't just raise the level of performance, it raises the slope of improvement. Just like Amazon and Google and other digital companies do literally hundreds, 200 experiments a day, we're beginning to do that in education. And it's made possible because of a digital infrastructure. Did you want to add something there?
Well, I'm a big fan of Newton, which is exactly what you're talking about. But I can't get my faculty to stop it.
Yeah.
Teaching as if they're in the 19th.
Absolutely. You know, it's a mindset. I mean, that's the hardest part to change is the culture, the mindset. The technology is easy to change. But if you put, second machine age technologies in front of people who are still thinking with 19th or 20th century mindset, you don't get the change you need. And if I can circle back to the initiative on the digital economy, that's part of what we're trying to do, is help think about the new processes, culture, and mindset that will complement these new technologies. I think we've got time for another question. Maybe somebody in the way back, just to be different. There's one, how about over there?
Hi. My question is, do you foresee the Eastern economies kind of accelerating the second machine age? Because if you look at Eastern economies, the kind of infrastructure they have is, probably ripe for disruption. So do you foresee this accelerating there than, the Western economies?
Well, yeah, I think there are different economies, different cultures that are taking this on in different ways. Let me make a distinction, not necessarily between Eastern and Western, because I think Japan, in many ways, is having many of the same issues that Western Europe, the United States does. But if you look at, say, China, India, Thailand, you do see a fundamentally different approach towards economic growth that historically has worked very well for most of the 20th century. It was a strategy based on basically low wages and being the factory for the world, attracting manufacturing and other industries there on the basis that we've got workers who can do the work for a much lower price, and that help bring economic growth to them. I think that in many ways they're going to be even more challenged by the second machine age than the countries that are having the more advanced industrialized or post-industrialized countries. And the reason for that is that strategy of relying on low wages that aren't necessarily the most skilled workers, it works well if you're competing against other humans. It doesn't work so well if you're competing against Baxter, okay? Machines that are improving by leaps and bounds, that are on a trajectory that looks more like Moore's Law than union wages, are going to be putting more and more pressure. I wouldn't want to be competing with one of them. And trying to go head-to-head with them is kind of like telling John Henry to lift more weights so he could compete against the steam engine 100 years ago. That's may buy you a little bit of time, but not in the long run. They're going to have to focus, as we will, on education, on creativity, on doing things that machines can't do. And that's going to be a big challenge, and it may be quite disruptive for some of those economies. It's a little bit of a contrarian take, but it's the kind of thing that when you look at the underlying data and the underlying technologies, you can't help but see much more of a head-to-head battle in some of those industries. And just to give you some data, there has actually been a decline. As you know, there's been a decline in manufacturing jobs in the United States, but I was surprised to see that you go to China, there's 20 million fewer manufacturing jobs in China than there was in the 1990s. They are the #1 consumer of industrial robots. And not only are things being automated there, but companies like Apple are bringing manufacturing back to the United States. The Mac Pro is now being built in Austin, Texas, not because the wages are lower there, but because wages just aren't an important part of the equation anymore. So the bumper sticker version of it that Andy and I have in our book is that in many ways offshoring is just a way station on the road to automation, and that's the big story that's going forward. So I need to wrap up here because I know we need to go upstairs soon, but I want to thank you all for giving me a chance to share some of the research and for some of the questions you asked, and I hope you will be contributors to, if not the global community, but at least the MIT community that tries to address these questions around the digital economy. I hope you share my enthusiasm for the power of these technologies, but also my willingness to take up the challenge to use them in a way that creates the kind of shared prosperity, the kind of better world that I think we all would like to see. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.